Alright kiddos, so this is the Cold War video. We're going to go over all these topics in greater detail after the Common Assessment, but there are some key things that you do need to know about the Cold War to be successful in your Common Assessment. So be sure to take a lot of great notes. Again, pause, repeat, replay if you need to, and definitely raise your hand if you have any questions. Alright, let's go ahead and get started with Potsdam. Potsdam was again that conference after specifically VE Day, between the meetings of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. But to really understand how we got into this Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, we kind of have to understand how did things get really tense, even at the end of World War II. So here you have the Yalta Conference. We have FDR right in the middle, and he's flanked by Churchill and Stalin on his left and right. What I really want to notice about this picture is that they do seem very, very friendly with each other. They're looking at each other, their smiles, the chairs are very close to each other, they're even connected. And overall, it does look like there's some harmony going on between these three major leaders of the World War II allies. But that really changes when we get to Potsdam. And we have the meeting of Truman, Stalin, and Churchill yet again. Notice how the chairs that are chosen are a lot, no longer attached to one another. Notice also that the men in these pictures are definitely, they don't look as friendly with each other. They're definitely not as comfortable with each other as the men in this picture. And the reason why a lot of this tension does happen is that there is specifically a lot of tension happening between Truman and Stalin. Truman is very upset that the Soviets did take so long to come into the war. Truman is not a fan of communism overall, and so he's not a fan of Stalin and his political philosophies. And Stalin, on the other hand, is very upset with the United States because the United States didn't tell them about the development of the atomic bomb, and ultimately feels like the United States is doing a lot of things that they should be included on as a potential world power. And so there's a lot of tension going on between these two even at the end of World War II. So when World War II does end, we're going to have the development of a foreign policy known as containment, developed specifically by this man here, George Kennan. George Kennan is a diplomat who's going to come up with this idea of containment. What containment basically means is we need to stop the spread of communism. We need to do everything that we can to make sure that communism does not go beyond where it already is. So for the United States, basically, it appeared that the Soviet Union was coming out to attack the world and convert the world to their political philosophies. But for the Soviet Union, it felt like that the United States was joining up with other countries and again forming an alliance that was going against the Soviets. And so from both sides, it definitely seems like the other side seems as the aggressor, and both sides seems as the little guy in these cases. So a Cold War, specifically between the Soviets and the United States, is a war that is basically a war that doesn't involve military conflict between these two figures. So throughout this whole war, the Soviets will never attack the United States. The United States will never attack the Soviets. We'll come really close to it, but we won't actually engage in military conflict. So in order for the aggression to actually play out, we have other types of competitions. One of those competitions is the arms race. The Soviets eventually figure out how to develop their own atomic bomb, and you can see this blue cartoon is that both leaders of their respective countries are trying to collect as many nuclear weapons as possible to make sure that their arsenal is larger than the other person's arsenal. Again, we'll go into greater details in this after the Common Assessment, but just for the purposes of the Common Assessment, you should definitely know what is the arms race. This idea of trying to collect as many weapons of mass destruction or nuclear weapons and things like that, as many as they can, specifically more than the other one, obviously. Other races that occurred during the Cold War is the space race. This one's unclear as to what they were trying to achieve in terms of who would win this race. So some people think that the Soviets won because they're the first ones to send a satellite into space. This is Sputnik. It is the first Soviet. It's the first satellite in space, and the Soviets were the ones to launch it. So it seems like the Soviets were winning. The Soviets were also the first ones to send a living creature into space. This is Laika. Laika is a stray dog that they found on the streets. She has a very sad story. She was a stray, and they took in a bunch of strays and just tried to train them to sit in one of these satellite thingies. And because she was the most obedient, she was the one that was sent up. They had no plans to really bring her back, and so she does die in space. I think of heat exhaustion or suffocation, but it is a really tragic story. But that the sacrifices that she has paid for the advancements of science and all those kinds of things. The United States, though, is also the first ones to send a primate into space, so that was a cool thing. But we do have this kind of back and forth. Again, the Soviets sent a satellite, they sent the first living creature, we sent a primate, so this back and forth makes it difficult to determine who's the winner. But the United States ultimately decides that they're the winner because they're the first ones to send a man onto the moon. And that mission was on Apollo 11. One of the most famous astronauts on the Apollo 11 trip is Neil Armstrong. I found this joke about Neil Armstrong that I thought was funny, so you can go ahead and take a second to read it. All right. Both the United States and the Soviet Union will do a number of different things to maintain that this was a justifiable war. So one of the things that they will do is, especially in the United States, is they will release a lot of propaganda in order to encourage the population to support the war. So here you can see this propaganda is if America falls under communism, there will be a lot of people that are attacked, the American flag will burn, a lot of craziness. So that's one way to definitely encourage the population or the civilian population to support the war effort. Other ways that they definitely encouraged, if not the civilian population, the global population to support the war effort was economic aid. So one way to definitely influence other countries is to give them money so that they owe you money. And both the Soviet Union and the United States was in a good place after World War II. So after World War II, for example, a lot of the European countries, displayed by their maps here, were suffering economically, namely because they were trying to rebuild after the devastation of war. The Soviet Union offered a number of different loans to these European countries, and the United States got really scared, namely because if these European countries owed the Soviets money, it was very possible that they could fall under a Soviet control or Soviet influence and eventually fall under communism as well. So the United States instead is going to provide a lot of economic aid to these European countries to fix themselves after World War II. And as a result, we do influence them to maintain our allied relationships with a lot of these countries. So going back to this, again, the number of different ways that we can fight a Cold War without directly fighting against each other, the Soviet Union will never directly fight against the United States, is that we can have something known as proxy wars, meaning that we will have other people fight the wars for us. So namely, we're going to have three main countries that are going to fight this war for us. We'll have China, we'll have Vietnam, and finally we'll have Korea. So China is an interesting case because you can see in 1846, towards the end of World War II, or at the end of World War II, what we have is a strong communist government forming, or communist party forming in this upper right hand corner. But China has been undergoing the civil war for some time now. They just mainly put their civil war on hold because during World War II they had to fight a war with Japan. Now that the war with Japan is over, China's going back to their civil war because a lot of people in China were suffering because they felt like the government wasn't really providing enough for them. So the nationalist government, the other side that's not communist, is going to is going to be the one that is not providing aid, but it is the one that is supported by the United States. The United States doesn't really provide enough support during the Civil War, so you can see over the years, communism will spread, namely because they will be supported by the Soviet Union, number one, and number two, because they will offer a lot of assistance to the people who are suffering. So by 1950, you can see as the map continues to move, by 1950, China will fall under communism. And it's considered a really big failure for the United States, specifically because this was our whole policy. We wanted to contain communism, and China was a clear example that we weren't doing that. So that's really going to affect our decision to go into Vietnam, specifically with LBJ. So LBJ will get the legislative government to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution ultimately gives the president power to make the decision about whether or not to support the efforts going on in Vietnam. It's ultimately considered a really big failure for the United States, a big embarrassment. It was not a very popular war because of simply the length. It was between the years of around 1945 to 1975 that we were involved with something with Vietnam, and so for a lot of people it was a lot longer than it needed to be, and as a result it did seem like it was not a very good war. So because it was such a long war, in 1969, Nixon will be elected because LBJ is kind of considered that he's not doing a good job, things like that, with Vietnam. So in 1969, Nixon will be elected and he will develop the policy of Vietnamization. Vietnamization is the idea that we're going to slowly pull our troops out by training South Vietnamese troops to replace us over time. And so, as more South Vietnamese troops are trained to take our place, we're going to go ahead and pull more and more boys out. So, by 1975, we do have all of our troops out. But unfortunately, by that time, South Vietnam does fall under communism. So, when Vietnam is reunited into one country, it is a communist country. Our last major war, our last major proxy war that is also influenced by Vietnam as well as China is the Korean War. Again, Korea geographically is supported by both China and the Soviet Union. All those things is causing us to be concerned that Korea will fall under the same fate as Vietnam. But so the United States will get involved to, again, kind of contain the situation. Here, but ultimately, I don't know why the map stopped working, but ultimately, what is going to happen is that by the end of the war, the line, the 38th parallel here that you see, is going to stay put. And so they will continually be divided, and it's still divided to this day along the 38th parallel, North Korea and South Korea. And so it's kind of considered yet another unsuccessful war, namely because there was no change in between where it was when we started the war and where we ended, maintained that division of the 38th parallel. So that's the Cold War. Those are the things that you kind of need to know for your common assessment. Again, we'll review a lot of this stuff in greater detail after the common assessment. Be sure to review anything that you might have missed, replay, pause, all the things that you will need to do. And again, if you have any questions, just raise your hand and let me know. All right, see you guys later.